And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author, Robert R. Reilly, the book America on Trial, A Defense of the Founding, published by Ignatius Press, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com for all books Catholic. Welcome, Robert Reilly, to EWTN's Bookmark.
Delight to be with you.
Now, you were on with Father Mitch a couple of years ago with another book, right?
That's right. That was the one addressing the problem of the so-called homosexual marriage and what the natural law argument against it is.
Mm-hmm. Now, this book here, in particular, America on Trial, what prompted this book? Was this something Ignatius came to you about? Was this something that you saw in the culture that you thought needed to be addressed?
Well, I think it was both ways. Ignatius was interested in the idea, in fact, encouraged me to undertake it. And the America is so evidently on trial. We've seen it in the riots in the streets, the 1619 Project from the New York Times Magazine. But no one is surprised in a way by the attack from the radical left. Let's say those are rather traditional attacks. Various watered down forms of Marxism, Leninism are at it again. What is curious and what really provoked me initially were the attacks on the American founding coming from, let's say, conservative, religious, and in fact, Catholic intellectuals who were asking themselves, why are we in this terrible situation in which we find ourselves today? A morally corrupt country, the dissolution of the family, widespread pornography, drugs, you know, the litany. And they said it was because of the founding, because the founding was a poison pill infected with radical notions of individual autonomy from the Enlightenment. And while Christianity was vigorous in this country, that was suppressed. But as Christianity has receded, now we see this radical autonomy manifest in all these different ways, whether it's transgenderism or abortion, etc. So they think the original sin was the founding, that it was fatally flawed by those Enlightenment principles. And they can point to things like Anthony Kennedy's notorious Supreme Court decisions in which he specifically refers to autonomy as authorizing, say, sodomy as a constitutional principle, and then finding in the Constitution this right to so-called homosexual marriage. Yeah, so I try to take on that.
Well, it's interesting because it always struck me that you're kind of dealing with this kind of alleged socialism, communitarianism, but yet this radical autonomy at the same time.
Well, I don't think those Catholic critics are socialists. They're actually profound thinkers in their own right and are, in fact, correct.
But I mean, as far as the culture is concerned, there seems to be that aspect, as you talked about, that autonomy on one level and yet this socialist aspect on the other.
Well, the ironic thing is that this autonomy that everyone is encouraged to seek is under the aegis of the state, which grows all the more powerful the further people carry this so-called autonomy. Let's say it's kind of a state-sponsored autonomy, and the only time you're not autonomous, or at least allowed to exercise your constitutional freedoms, is if you speak against it, if you suggest there's really no foundation for homosexual marriage, etc.
Right. Now you say the tension between the primacy of reasons as it was theologically, philosophically, and politically elaborated versus the primacy of will as it was expressed in these same areas is the driving engine of this book. What does that mean?
It means the book is animated by this seesaw between the notion that right is the rule of the stronger, said by Thrasymachus to Socrates in the Republic, or that no, right is what is reasonable, right is what is good. Right is not a product of who's the strongest or who is exercising power. And we've seen throughout history various theological and philosophical schools espousing one side or the other. And the book really takes us through a long stretch of history in which this contest has been fought out to the point of the American Revolution, which I contend was a revolution against the primacy of will and power to reestablish the primacy of reason, the rule of reason, reason as law, and not arbitrary will.
Right. As you say here, was the American founding rooted in the Judeo-Christian heritage and natural law, or was it infused with the notions of the radical autonomy and perfectibility of man, and therefore inimical to the Christian and natural law conception of reality? Was the founding America's original sin, as you mentioned? And then you asked the question, in other words, can one concomitantly be a good person and a good American?
There you go.
So your answer is?
My answer is that according to the principles of the American founding, you can be. And as you well know, the founding was undertaken by an overwhelmingly Christian nation. Of course, they were overwhelmingly Protestants, but no one celebrated the American founding more enthusiastically than did the Catholics at the time, including Father John Carroll, who then became the first bishop in the United States. So I think that if you examine the Declaration of Independence, the principles articulated in the preamble, the reliance upon God that is mentioned there so decisively in the four mentions of God as creator, as nature's God, as supreme judge, as providence, you will see that our independence is based upon dependence upon him. Now, that all men are created equal was a generally accepted moral principle within the Catholic Church, articulated well before the founding by such great thinkers as Cardinal Robert Bellarmine and Francisco Suarez, two of the most notable opponents to the divine right of kings at that time.
And you talk about them in the book. You quote them and you refer to them, right?
Length. So the founders thought that the principles they were articulating were based upon transcendent, immutable truths. Ultimately, we have to address the question, were they right or were they wrong? And that includes, is there such a thing as the transcendent? Can truth be immutable? Is truth so heavily conditioned by history that we really can't say what's true at all times, at all places, for all people?
Right.
They thought you could. One reason we're falling apart today is because so many people think, no, you can't. We have different times. We have different truths.
Right.
Therefore, there's no such thing as absolute truth.
The whole critical theory idea of everything, really, that we're looking at today. Now, you also say here the controversy is not new, although it has become more heated. The view of a fatally flawed foundation has grown stronger because the decline in American public life and morals has dramatically accelerated it, gaining it an attention that otherwise would not. Is that diminution of Christianity in the culture that's having that effect?
Well, it's certainly one of the major contributions to the corruption of the culture. But the other is, again, the effect of what I speak of in the epilogue at the back of the book of German historicism, of exactly the idea that there is no such thing as transcendent, immutable truth. And therefore, you end up with moral relativism, progressivism, that was manifested strongly here in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, Woodrow Wilson was, of course, a progressivist and made the statement that we're not to be bound by the principles in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, because what we're beholden to are not those, but to Darwin.
Right.
There you go. If Darwin's right, and then we can be sort of.
The truth's always evolving, isn't it? Then I guess in one way.
Things are evolving, and we have to evolve with it.
Right. Now you said the more odious Christianity becomes to the dominant forces of American contemporary thought and jurisprudence, the more its beliefs are denounced as "quote unquote" hate crimes. The greater the inclination of Christians and other religious people to find America odious in return.
I think that's what's behind the impetus of, or let's say, the favorable reception to this poison pill view, because people are almost desperate to find an explanation for how we could have disintegrated to this point. So, whose fault is it? The argument's not new that the founding was a poison pill. What's new is the greater reception of that view.
Okay.
And I think that's the reason.
You say, although Christians have sometimes been ambivalent, if not hostile, toward democratic constitutional order, which you'll see that Christianity provided a bedrock of realistic Thomist metaphysics and theological doctrine that allowed for its evolution and legitimacy. A British scholar, Larry Seidentrop, writes, "Secularism is Christianity's gift to the world. The very idea of secularism is Christian in origin." That's interesting.
Well, you know, and that wonderful part of the gospel when they try to trick our Lord with a denarius and ask whether it is permissible to pay the Roman tax, he asks, of course, whose image is on it. They say Caesar's, and he says, "Give unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And the gospel describes the audience as amazed. As well they might have been, because no one had ever said such a thing before or suggested that there was a spiritual realm in which God was sovereign and a separate realm in which Caesar was. And that you could almost say this is an early intimation of the idea that there's a separation between church and state.
Now you say the book then is not so much about the founding itself, it's about the provenance of its ideas. Its purpose is to demonstrate that the ideas of democratic constitutional government have only one set of roots in human history. What is that?
I say those roots are inextricably wound in Christianity, which brought together the great revelation of Jewish monotheism and the fact that we're all made in the Imago Dei, and of the great gift of the Greeks, which is what Benedict XVI called philosophy. Those two things were conjoined in Christianity, which then provided the foundation in the Middle Ages of the development of every single modern constitutional principle. The idea of popular sovereignty would not have arisen unless the equality of people had been accepted. The equality of people would not have been accepted without the teaching of Christianity. The popular sovereignty consequently led to the notion that people's consent is required in their rule. And how would such a consent be expressed? Well, through representation, through voting, etc. And if the ruler should break the agreement through which he receives his sovereignty over the people, if there's anything the people can do about it.
Right.
And uniformly throughout the Middle Ages, they insisted upon the right to revolution, as did Thomas Aquinas himself. So you have it, popular sovereignty, the requirement of consent, the right to representation, and the right to revolution. Not many people are aware that those principles were initially developed in the canon law of the Catholic Church.
Now, you said here, you mentioned this phrase that I thought was interesting. The Lockean DNA theory of the founding is radically reductionist. What does that mean?
Well, that's the thesis of the two speakers, the two thinkers whom I principally critique in this book.
Right.
Everyone admits that John Locke had a major influence on 18th century America and upon the thinking of the founders. But who had a major influence on Locke? From where did his thinking come? And their answer was Thomas Hobbes, who wrote Leviathan and said that the state is absolute. And it exercises absolute power over man. And that Locke is really Thomas Hobbes with a smiley face. So you see that DNA, what they really mean is not that the founding was Lockean, but that it was Hobbesian. And they will say that out front. See, if the founding were Hobbesian, it would make very logical the fact that we're living under an increasingly Hobbesian state now in the United States, as we see it, the state developing more and more of the features that Thomas Hobbes described it should have in the Leviathan, and particularly under the lockdown of the period of the virus, you saw, let's say, the face of Leviathan becoming clearer and clearer.
Right, in a sense of some of the statements made by governors, etc., the rules put out there. And it's interesting in a way because is this tie into the growth of the whole nanny state, where there seems to be a greater acceptance people have that, well, the government is supposed to be involved with all these things. They are supposed to be taking care of us.
Well, it's extraordinary the powers that have been assumed by various branches of the government. The CDC came out and said that no one could be asked to leave their apartments or homes. Well, I mean, yes, that's a very nice thing, but where did the Centers for Disease Control get the constitutional authority to make such a proclamation? I'm in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and I began wondering exactly how the governor here obtained the power to say, well, you can't go to church, that's not an essential service, but of course you can have an abortion because that is an essential service. Now there you see, that's a Hobbesian state right there.
Right. Now, you talk about Hobbes in the book, you talk about the divine right of kings, John Locke. Now, you also talk about Martin Luther. Why did you focus on Luther in this book?
Well, because I think we needed to trace from exactly where the notion of the divine right of kings came and how the state became absolute. You see, I needed to answer the question, if we had all of these wonderful constitutional principles evolving in the Middle Ages, why wasn't there just a straight line from the Middle Ages to the American founding? What interrupted it? And what interrupted it was the divine right of kings, the idea that God directly appoints the ruler, that the people are not sovereign, as Martin Luther said. God appoints the prince makes the law, the prince is above the law, that there's no right to revolution against the sovereign, no matter how tyrannical he is, and there's no right to representation. So all those constitutional principles get wiped out in the most radical forms of the Reformation. As you know, under Luther, with the dissolution of Christendom and the destruction of the institutional church, the state absorbed the churches became national churches, and the prince or the king became the head of the church.
Right. That's why the prince was so supportive of some of these ideas,
Yes,
obviously.
indeed, he was giving me that
he,
power.
he was benefiting greatly. I want to jump towards, in the closing minutes of the show, chapter 10, because I thought, especially what's going on today, because we talk about what's going on, we see in the streets, and we talk about the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And your point is, it should be clear that the American Revolution was not an exclusive product of the Enlightenment, but has its roots in the deeper natural law and natural rights tradition. If you want to look to the Enlightenment, you look to the French Revolution. Why is that really important for people to look at that today?
I think it's important because many people today can't distinguish between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. They say they're really the same. But the French Revolution, in its Jacobin radical form, was premised upon the perfectibility of man here through his own powers, which of course would require that the state have absolute power to assist in this project of self-perfection. And what was the major obstacle to that project? The church. The American founding could not have had such a dechristianization campaign because they were, for the most part, believing Christians. They didn't believe in the perfectibility of man. They believed that man could only be made perfect in the mercy of Christ, and that his obligation was to repent and conform himself to God's will through the grace of Christ.
Right.
Now, what you see in the streets today, I think, is this idea that, well, we should already be perfect. And the reason we're not is somebody else's fault.
Right, absolutely.
So the sense of grievance. And so let's attack them, or it's this institution's fault. Let's destroy this institution.
Right. Well, you talk about some of the players like the Marquis de Sade being, in a sense, like the theologian of the movement. And he wrote that the murder of the king must be followed by the murder of God. Only when the morality represented by divine kingship was abolished could man express himself in the fullness of his pornographic existence. The idea of God is the sole wrong for which I cannot forgive mankind, is what he said. Cruelty is simple and energy in a man that civilization has not yet already corrupted. And then a gentleman named Saint-Just was overheard to say that a nation can regenerate itself only upon mounds of corpses. He proclaimed we must not only punish traitors, but all people who are not enthusiastic. There are only two kinds of citizens, the good and the bad. That sounds very much like Mao. And sometimes it seems like the cancel culture in some ways that we hear today, that not only can you have to not only support, but you have to support it in exactly the way we want it supported.
Yes, I think you're right. And as soon as you're embarked upon this project of the self-divinization of man, you're going to end up with some kind of totalitarian state. So we see in the French Revolution the prototype exactly of the communist revolution in China, of the Soviet Revolution, and all the incredible destruction and mass murder that has taken place in the name of man perfecting himself, instead of having the humility of letting God perfect him by offering God's own life, if only man will accept his mercy and love.
Let me ask you, in thinking about the difference, as you indicated, that the idea of dechristianizing the revolution and the American Revolution would have never happened. Why would a country that was basically, let's say, predominantly a Protestant country have that perspective, yet France at the time was a Catholic country? Why didn't it stand up against this dechristianization?
Well, there was an attempt to stand up against it, and that's why there was a very busy guillotine, not just in Paris, but in other parts of the country. And there was a massive peasant uprising in the Gironde.
Right, the Vendée, right.
The Vendée, rather.
Right.
And the incredible slaughter of those people that was carried out by the revolutionary parties. So Yeah, there was resistance, but you have to see there was an enormous amount of erosion through the radical French Enlightenment.
Hmm.
And when you see that Marie Antoinette was reading Rousseau, you know that
Hmm.
the the intellectual fiber of the traditional Catholic French mind had been
Hmm.
eroded to the point that it didn't have a lot of resistance, and the
Right,
parts that did resist were physically eliminated.
right. So at this point in time with what's going on, do you think part of the problem, you talk about the year zero, talking about the French Revolution, which reminded me of what happened in Cambodia as well, but almost this idea of this loss of history, not teaching history, and its impact on our young people?
I would be very surprised if many young people knew the fundamental history of the United States, of what actually took place in the American founding, because they're so easily bamboozled by this propaganda that our real DNA is slavery, that we've been a racist country from the beginning, and that's why we're a racist country now, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
I mean, aside from overlooking the Civil War and a couple of
Right,
other major events, you'd have to really know nothing
right.
to hold those opinions. And the destruction of education, or rather the miseducation of not just simply youth, but what's taking place in the universities and graduate schools has
Right.
led to this damage. It's late in the day.
Hmm.
It's very late in the day. We either recover not just the history, but more importantly, the principles that animated the creation of this nation, or our goose is cooked.
Right. Very good. Well, we really appreciate Robert R. Reilly writing this book and defending America, America on Trial, Defense of the Founding, published by Ignatius Press, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Thank you so much, Robert, for joining us here on Bookmark, and we invite everybody to join us next time. Thank you.
Privilege being with you. Thank you.